welcome back. So for this lecture, we're going to continue talking about morphology, but moving a little bit more into word formation, looking at mostly examples from English, but a few others as well. And these are going to be common processes that you see for how words are formed in various languages of the world. So when we think about word formation, there's a lot of different ways that words can enter into our language's lexicon, or our list of words that are in a language. And so similar to how we discussed phonological processes, where there was some sort of patterned reason for a word or a sound to sort of behave the way it does, words have similar processes as well, things that are very common to have happen across languages of the world that we see happening over time as words are formed or as we develop new words or change things that already exist, etc. So we have a few different ones that we'll focus on. The first several that we'll look at are these ones here, and then we have another set that we'll look at in a moment. So we'll start with affixation, reduplication, compounding, and backformation, or it's also known as reanalysis. And these are very common ones, and there's several others that are quite common in English and other languages as well. But these are some of the ones that you see very frequently in a lot of languages of the world. So if we start with affixation, the addition of prefixes, suffixes, infixes, or circumfixes is what this entails. So we commonly add affixes to roots. This is something that all languages do when you have affixes. And so this is something that we do very frequently. So we can add re in front of a root and get rewire or refire or reboot. We can add ism to the end of a root and get something like patriotism or organism. And then the infixes that we talked about, things like abso-fucking-lutely, are other ways that we can put an affix into a root or attach it to a root in some way and create new words out of it. And so for the derivational ones, we're creating a new word that means something different. For the inflectional or grammatical ones, we're just changing something about the grammar and not actually creating a new lexeme from this. So affixation is going to apply to those different examples of those derivational affixes. And when we do this, we can make much more complex words, and we can continue adding multiple affixes. It doesn't have to just be a single one, which is common in English, but as we've seen in some examples already, there are multiple languages that will add lots and lots and lots of affixes to get very large words. We can do this in English as well. So we can start with something like break, and we can add an affix and get breakable, and then we can say unbreakable, and then we can add another and say unbreakability. And so we can add multiple affixes to different words as they are. It's not just adding to a root specifically. Or we can end up with very large words like anti-disestablishmentarianism, which has several different affixes attached to the roots in that one. And then we saw in previous examples languages like Yupik that use lots and lots of affixes commonly. And these are called polysynthetic languages or agglutinative languages in some cases, depending on the language. And then languages that are closer to English, or also things like Mandarin Chinese, that tend to use mostly bare roots and not a lot of affixes, would be called analytic languages. And we won't really spend a lot of time focusing on that distinction, but, but you may hear those words come up from time to time. Another common process that happens in some languages is known as reduplication. And in that word, you hear duplicate, and this is exactly what's happening. We're repeating either all or part of a morpheme for particular reasons. So the most common reasons that we see this in languages of the world are things like creating diminutives, so smaller versions of something. So we do this in English with child-directed speech, so itty-bitty would be an example of that, where we're repeating part of the syllable, part of the word, in the way that we're speaking when we're using child-directed speech. In Hebrew, they use this for diminutives in their grammar. So for instance, if you have klav as dog, then making puppy, you would take part of that word and repeat it, so you get klavav as puppy. So a smaller version of something. Or for cat, chatul, chatatul would be kitten. So you're getting a few of those sounds. It looks like it's typically the second syllable in Hebrew that's doing this. And then you're not repeating the entire morpheme in this case. In this case, this would be a partial reduplication, where you're taking a piece of the morpheme, saying it again, and then creating the diminutive, the smaller version. The other more common way that this is seen in languages of the world is through things like plurals. So if you have one morpheme and then you say it twice, it means plural. This is kind of a logical thing that you might imagine. So in Wiradjuri, an Australian language, the word for crow is wagga. But if you say wagga wagga, that means many crows. I really like that example. It's fun to say. So you can see that by duplicating that, getting a reduplication of the entire form, you end up using it as a plural. It means that there's more than one of them. And then you can also use these for emphasis, and this is something that we do in English sometimes for what we would call contrastive reduplication, where you're using the unduplicated morpheme in comparison or to contrast with whatever we're doing as the reduplicated form. So a common thing that you might hear even children say is, I like her, but I don't like her. Or you might hear someone say, he speaks English, talking about British English as opposed to American English. So by reduplicating it, we're contrasting with the way that it might be interpreted if it was just used singularly without the reduplication. The next one, compounding, is something that we do frequently in English and many other Germanic languages, where we take two roots together and join them into a single word. So things like birthday, basketball, hairbrush, laptop, these are all roots that can stand on their own in English, but we put them together and create a separate concept. And so by doing this, you're taking the full root of both of them in order to get a compound. And in English, we do this very frequently, and depending on how well known they are or how much time has passed since we started using them, in terms of our spelling system and our writing system, it's not always consistent what they look like. Sometimes they have a hyphen, sometimes they have a space, sometimes they don't have a space at all and it just looks like one word. So we can have something like coin operated, which has a hyphen in it, or White House, or Sawtooth are mountains that are local. And so the spelling of that isn't always consistent, and so compounds can look very different in English. But what you're not going to focus on is the spelling so much as the meaning, and intonation when you're speaking these can also give you some information. So if I'm talking about a hot dog as something I eat, it's going to sound different than saying a hot dog. So rather than having a sort of pause or intonational break between the two words, if I'm using it as a single concept, it'll have just one intonational contour. So hot dog versus hot dog. And there's some languages that are very fond of compounding and do this very complexly. German is one of those languages. You may have examples that you can think of. And if you speak German, then the example that I'm about to play for you should be something that you find humorous. And even if you don't speak German, you should still be able to follow along and see the way that compounding can work. And this is a very humorous approach to it, and it gives you a kind of exaggerated view, but it's still a way that you can see the kind of compounding that can happen and how complex it can be in some languages.
In einem kleinen Dorf, da lebte einst ein Mädchen mit dem Namen Barbara. Und Barbara war überall für ihren wunderbaren Rhabarberkuchen bekannt. Deshalb nannte man sie auch Rhabarber-Barbara. Rhabarber-Barbara merkte schnell, dass sie mit ihrem Kuchen Geld verdienen könnte und eröffnete eine Bar, die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar. Die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar lief gut und hatte schnell Stammkunden. Und die 3 bekanntesten unter ihnen, 3 Barbaren, kamen so oft in die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar, um von Rhabarber-Barbaras leckeren Rhabarberkuchen zu essen, dass man sie auch kurz die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbaren nannte. Die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbaren hatten schöne Bärte. Und wenn die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbaren ihre Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbärte pflegen wollten, gingen sie zum Barbier. Der einzige Barbier, der einen solchen Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbart bearbeiten konnte, hieß Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbart-Barbier. Der Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbart-Barbier ging auch gern in die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar, um von Rhabarber-Barbaras leckeren Rhabarberkuchen zu essen, zu dem er gerne ein Bier trank, das er dann feierlich das Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbart-Barbier Bier nannte. Das Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbart-Barbierbier konnte man nur in einer ganz bestimmten Bar kaufen. Und die Verkäuferin des Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbart-Barbierbiers hinter der Theke der Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar-Barbarenbart-Barbier-Bierbar hieß Bärbel. Und so gingen die Rhabarber-Barbara-Barbaren zusammen mit dem Rhabarber-Barbara-Barbara-Barenbad-Barbier und Rhabarber-Barbara-Barbara-Barbara-Barbier-Bierbarbärbel in die Rhabarber-Barbara-Bar, um von Rhabarber-Barbaras leckeren Rhabarberkuchen zu essen und einer Flasche eisgekühlten Rhabarber-Barbara-Barbara-Barenbad-Barbier-Biers anzustoßen. Prost!
The next one we'll talk about, back formation or reanalysis, is when we're creating a new word through some sort of analogy or reanalyzing what the word means and other forms that it could take. So some examples that we have in English are things like the word apron, which used to be the word napron. And because an and then another word sounds the same if you move the A to the, or if you move the N to the article, or if it's part of the noun, we've sort of changed and reanalyzed what the word is, and rather than it being a napron, it became an apron. And so over time, that N sort of moved, we got rid of it and put it on the article, and now we have the word apron. Another one that you might not realize is that we didn't used to have a plural for pea. So pea as in the food, the vegetable, used to just be peas, and it was non-count. Just always it was in that non-count form. But because it involved many, people interpreted this as saying, oh, well, if I have this huge bunch of peas, then I should be able to talk about just one singular pea. And so the word, the singular one, we didn't used to have. It was just that non-count that sounded like our plural. So it ended up getting reanalyzed as our plural. And then when you took that sound off, you would have what became our singular form. We also see happening in present day the use of different kinds of abbreviations, which you have, so could have, would have, should have, especially when you're typing or you're seeing this online, will end up, because it sounds like when you have could have, would have, should have, it sounds similar to the word of. We now see people often writing could of, would of, instead of the apostrophe VE, because they sound the same. So it's sort of reanalyzing what that compound word is, rather than recognizing that have is just being shortened into those contractions. So we have lots of examples of the things that can happen for this. And then we have several others that are quite common in some languages as well. So some of the others that we'll talk about: clipping, suppletion, blending, acronyms, invention, borrowing, and what's known as conversion. And these are all things that we do frequently in English. So if we start with clipping, this is where a lot of our slang comes from. So when we're clipping, we're just shortening the word, and this can happen at any place in the word. So we get gym for gymnasium, phone from telephone, flu from influenza. So it doesn't have to be a certain part of the word. We can take it from the beginning, we can take it from the end, we can take it from the middle of a word when we're clipping something out. And sometimes these clips become so much more common that you don't really hear the full form of the word as often anymore. It'd be really weird to tell your friend that you're going to the gymnasium after school to work out. You're just going to the gym, but that's where that word is coming from. And this also creates a lot of different kinds of slang words, casual forms, things like cray for crazy, bro for brother, obvi for obvious. So this example from a few years ago when I lived in Santa Barbara, I was mentioning to a friend that the wind was making it feel really weirdly chilly today, and she responded with totes chill, as in totally chilly. And so using that, and then also adding some affixes, sometimes multiple processes are taking place at the same exact time. And so you're getting these different kinds of clips when you're using slang and shorthand terms. Suppletion is one that is harder to trace and usually comes from long-term historical developments. And this is usually because of phonetically distinct roots of different forms that end up being used for the same word. And so typically they come from different original words. And then because we're only using some of one word and some of another one, we have a sort of gap in our system, and then we sort of merge them together to create a single form. So in English, the most common ones are things like forms of to be, to go, good and bad are often examples of this. So for be, you have ser, to be, And then you have things like eres for you are, or fui, I was, which don't conjugate the same way that you would expect something to. So these sort of irregular forms are often because of suppletion, where the root form is actually coming from a different word historically and then being sort of combined together into that same form. Same thing with go, and we do this in English as well. So Spanish, voy, I go, versus fue, he went. And you can see the English translation as well, right? So go versus went, where they're both coming from two different roots historically in Old English. And then we now have one system that looks irregular, but does have a historical story behind it. Same with something like good. So Dutch and English both do this. They are related languages. So good versus better versus best. Good is coming from a different root than better and best, but then they sort of merge together to talk about either just the standard quality versus the comparative or superlative. Another one that's very common that is similar to when we would think of compounds is what's known as blending. So we can combine parts of two different words to create a single word, sometimes using a full root of one and just a partial root of another, or just taking portions of two different roots and squishing them together. So this is just combining parts of words to create a single word. And so we can look at some examples. So something like smog, where we have a combination of smoke and fog, or spork with spoon and fork. Bit is probably not one that you knew was a blend, so this is actually a blend of binary and digit, so you get bit out of that. And then from Napoleon Dynamite, things like liger, or also tigon. So a liger would be a male lion and a female tiger. A tigon, so switching the order, would be a female lion and a male tiger. So we have lots of examples of these. Something as simple as brunch, breakfast and lunch, would also be a blend where we're putting two roots together and just using portions of them. Acronyms are different abbreviated forms, so we're taking forms of usually phrases or full sentences sometimes, and most frequently we're using the first letter of each word to do this. Not always. You've probably seen some different sort of unique approaches to acronyms that sometimes use the first couple letters of a word so that they can make the acronym sound more word-like. But we do this very frequently in shorthand, so things like OMG, WTF, LOL. And then there's others that end up sounding more like words as we use them more. We also use these in school things, so SAT, AP, GRE. The sub is another local example for that. And when we're using them frequently, sometimes they end up being pronounced as normal words, but we're usually still aware that they're acronyms. So things like NASA and NATO, we say them as a single word rather than saying them letter by letter, but we know that they stand for something. We're aware of that. Whereas others have sort of evolved into real words where we're not capitalizing them anymore. We're not thinking of them as acronyms. So some people are still aware that scuba started as an acronym and is now used just as a word, so self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. But a lot of people don't realize that laser is also an example of this, something that started as an acronym and became a word. And this actually stands for light amplification by simulated emission of radiation. That's really hard to say. We don't ever really see that. You hear laser and you say laser, but we don't even really think about what those original words were in the acronym because it's sort of evolved into just a real word on its own right. We can also just invent or coin new words. So if we have new technology or things come up where we have different slang, we can just create something out of the blue that doesn't have any sort of origin. This is actually a less common formation process in languages of the world. Some languages actually don't like doing this at all. But it's often found with things like inventions or product names or company names, where as you invent something or as you discover something or there's some sort of new concept that didn't exist previously, we have to give a name to it of some sort. Product names are often created, sometimes using some of these other morphological processes, and sometimes just using whatever information they have around. Company names are often invented as well. So Xerox comes from xerography, so it does have its specific origin. And then sometimes you get things like Google, which is coming from the word Google that refers to a very large number, and then changing the spelling of it to invent it into their company name. And when we're doing this and a coined term ends up being used very commonly, these end up being called eponyms. So if it's something that we don't really think about as associated with its created name, a coined term, usually for a product name or a company, then these become eponyms. So things like aspirin, a lot of people don't realize that that started out as a brand name and then became used to refer to the drug that's in that pill. Jello we often use regardless of if it's name brand or not. Polaroid, same thing. Any sort of instant picture we call a Polaroid, even though lots of other companies do this now as well. Xerox is another thing, go Xerox this for me, even if you're not using a Xerox machine. So there's a lot of times that we see this happen, but it's typically for inventions or some sort of product or company. And another very common one that we have is that we like to borrow things into languages sometimes. And different languages have different sort of influences of other languages in terms of how much borrowing they enjoy doing. So if we're incorporating a word from another language into our own, this would be an example of borrowing. And we do this because if we encounter something else, a different culture that has new artifacts, new ideas, it means new words. So this is often things like animals or different types of food. So moose, for instance, didn't exist as a word in English until American colonialism because there are no moose in England, but there were moose in America. And so they ended up just borrowing the Ojibwe word for moose and fitting it into our system and into our spelling system. And English as a language loves to borrow words. We borrow words from places all over the place. A lot of our words come from things like French and Greek and Latin, but we also borrow words from many other places. So things like algebra, coffee, orange are coming from Arabic. Nahuatl, which is spoken in Mexico and Central America, gives us things like chocolate and guacamole and ocelot. Arawakan, a Native American language, things like barbecue, canoe, hammock. Or Chinese gives us things like ketchup. Probably didn't realize that came from Chinese, tea, tofu. So we're constantly borrowing words in English. But some languages just don't like borrowing words. French tries to pretend that they don't borrow words, but they do, even though they say they don't. But a good example of a language that tends to resist borrowing is Icelandic. So they have a practice that's often called linguistic purism, where rather than borrowing a word from another language, when there's a new concept or something introduced into the language, they try to use native words that are already in the language to capture the idea. So something like computer might end up being fast human or fast brain or some sort of thing like that, that uses words that are already in existence and putting it together rather than borrowing. A sort of humorous example from Icelandic is that when Star Wars came out, Darth Vader was called Svarthafði, which translates to either black head or black cape in Icelandic. So they took the name and sort of used it as a way to use this linguistic purism to create a term that made sense within the language. But in the capital city of Reykjavik, there's actually a Hafði or Cape neighborhood, and there's actually a street called Svarthafði because it just means black cape, and so this neighborhood has lots of other colored cape street names. And this has been around since before they started using this for Darth Vader. So now there's actually a Darth Vader street that you can find in Reykjavik. So if you ever visit Iceland, you can go and find Darth Vader Street, and it would be the same name that is used within the movies in Icelandic. The last one that I'll talk about is conversion, which is also known as zero derivation. And this is something that we do frequently in English without really thinking about it, where we're changing the meaning or the word class, but we're not adding any morphology or changing the sound in any way. So in isolation, if I say, is knife a noun or a verb, you might not know. Or if I say, is walk a noun or a verb, in isolation, you might not know. You need the context to know because we can use them in either way depending on how we're using them in a sentence. So even though knife started as a noun, we can knife someone and use it as a verb. Walk is historically a verb, but we can go for a walk, and if we put that article in front of it, we can use it as a noun. And nothing's changing about the form itself, it's just the way that we're using it. And we can do this with almost any noun that exists and with many verbs as well. So I could make up something like, I'll lamp you, which doesn't really make sense, right? But you probably have some sort of idea in your head that it involves me hitting you with a lamp or some sort of thing like that. So you can come up with an interpretation of that. And so we can do what's known as verbing words, as Calvin and Hobbes would say, and using different forms of language in a different capacity by applying the correct morphology if it's in a different spot, by putting it in a different place in a sentence, but we're not actually changing the form of the word. So things like friending someone on Facebook, we turn friend into a verb by just using it as a verb and being able to add things like an ing ending that can only go on verbs. So that gives you an idea. So the next couple slides that I'll end with are practice slides. So you can pause, you can try it out, and then I'll put the answers up, and the next slide has a few more. You can pause, try it out, check the answers, and then that would be the end of this for you. So you can go ahead and pause if you'd like, and then the answers are here for you to compare with what you had, what kind of answers you got when you tested this out. Same for this slide, and some of these were examples that I've already given you, but you can sort of go back and try to figure out if you can remember what they are. So you can pause, test it out, and then compare the answers as well. So if you have any questions, don't forget, always available by email. You can schedule office hours, bring questions to class. This week we will have a slightly less structured class period, but we'll still be able to talk about these things. So go ahead, bring your questions to class, and we'll be able to talk about them together. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the complexities, or in some ways the sort of humor that can happen with the kinds of compounds. So German has an example of lots of extreme compounds. We tend to really only put two roots together, sometimes more than that, but not very frequently. And so that gives you an idea of some of the different ways that compounding can take